put that. I'm recording this session, so I'm recording this class. So in case that you don't want to be recorded, so please, you can of course use your micro, but then please avoid to use the camera, or of course you can always use the chat tool to put your questions or to make your comment. Just I wanted you to know that this session will be recorded. Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Larrea, and of course you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Mar. So I just want you to know that I'm only a few years older than you guys. So I was very recently doing my law degree, and ever since then, as Mar has said, I've been reading and writing about climate change. And among the things that I read, there is one topic that I find particularly interesting, and this class will be about this interesting topic. And we will begin with a story. So now imagine that Barcelona was so polluted that the government decided to place a dome over the city, just for the pollution not to escape the city and go to other parts of the country. So the thing is that you decide to stay at home in order to mitigate this pollution, but you are desperate because you need to eat, and in order to eat, you need to cook. And when you cook, you know that you would be releasing lots of CO2 that would contribute even more to the problem. So the question is, what's the first thing to do? What would you do? Let's take a poll. Who would be willing to eat considerably less, to almost stop eating, just so you don't contribute to this problem? So let me see. Okay, let's eat much less. So this may look like a simple question, but there are some moral dilemmas behind this question. There are some moral dilemmas that I would like to discuss about, because I already see that there are some people that are already saying that would not be willing to stop eating. And this is interesting, especially for those that would be willing to stop eating or decrease their food consumption. Why so? Why do you guys think that there are some people that would not stop eating? There are some people that would want to stop eating. Does anyone want to volunteer a reason why they decided to reply what you decided to reply? You may as well use the microphone or use the chat, or well, if you don't feel like participating, that's also fine for me. But what I want to present is that we can extract a principle. Extract the principle being there is a common resource here, that is the air, let's say, or the quantity of CO2 that we can emit, and we individually benefit from eating and from cooking, and therefore from polluting the air, let's say, or the environment. And however, when we do this, we cause problems to the rest of the group. I'm gonna stop now the poll, but thanks a lot for contributing and participating. So every time we are benefiting individually from this eating and cooking, we are causing negative effects on the rest of the people, the rest of the group. So we can establish that principle that we benefit from each other's sacrifices, but because we benefit from a sustainable environment. However, this is difficult to be regulated, right? Because there are some people that do not want to stop eating, do not want to decrease their food consumption. So let's make it a bit trickier now. Imagine that people from Barcelona have different quality kitchens, different quality ovens. So for instance, us people living in El Born, which is an old part of the city, have older kitchens that pollute more as compared to other kitchens from other parts of the city, for instance, Pedralbes, because they have fantastic quality kitchens, best kitchens in the market, and they pollute very, very little. So imagine that the comparison would be somewhere around one pizza that is baked in an oven from Elborn consumes or emits as much CO2 as 10 pizzas from Pedralbes. So the questions would be, how can we regulate this so that it is fair for both people from Pedralbes and people from Elborn? Is it fair for people from Pedralbes to eat as little as other people, even though they would be polluting way less than the rest of the people? Or let's put it the other way around, is it fair for people from Elborn, who have way less means as compared to people from Pedralbes, to eat less, just because they don't have the means or they don't have the capacity? Would you establish a discriminatory rule? So these questions surround the idea of sharing resources and regulating how we consume these resources when they are limited. Does it ring a bell? Does anyone want to know what I'm talking about? Have you guys ever heard about something that is called the tragedy of the commons? Anyone? The tragedy of the commons is, it symbolizes the expected degradation of the environment every time a group of people share a resource, a natural resource. So in this case, as we established as a principle, it would be the air, let's say, or the quantity of CO2 that we can emit. And basically, individually, we benefit from eating and consuming this air and emitting CO2, but we benefit from each other's sacrifices. And the same happens with climate change, right? States benefit from their economic activities because they bring wealth, but they also cause other problems, such as climate change, which negatively affect the rest of the countries. Therefore, states benefit from each other's sacrifices because they benefit overall from a sustainable environment. Sorry. And as it happens with people living in Barcelona, in the global community, there are states with different capacities. There are states that have less means, like people in Elborn, and states that have more capacities, let's say, like people from Pedralbes. And it all sounds very redundant and silly, but when we translate it, or when we wonder how we can regulate this tragedy of the commons, how can we establish common rules to very different countries, it becomes trickier. And so I just wanted to set the base for what it will be the class. And the class, the interesting thing that I consider that I wanted to talk to you about is precisely this, is how do we solve all these problems, all this inequality, and all these problems that are caused by a problem that is mainly caused by some and instead suffered by others. So I will be talking about this, and during the class, I will aim at responding to these questions. First, who is responsible to pay for climate change related efforts in the poorest countries, the countries that contribute very little to the problem that nonetheless hits them the hardest? Then how is the money delivered to these countries? How does it move from rich countries to poor countries, and how is it implemented? Is this money enough? And are there any problems related with implementation? Are there any side effects maybe on local communities or indigenous peoples? So let me first start very briefly with the problem, with the fact that climate impacts are especially hard on developing countries. So here you have a map on the risks that climate change poses in every country, and you see that the reddish, yellow, reddish colors are basically on developing countries, whereas the green colors are mainly in developed countries. And this may sound maybe too convenient. I don't want to really go too much into that because this is just data from natural science studies, but if you want to know more about it, you may just feel free to ask about it. But basically, developing countries, well, you probably already know this, but are just technically are the ones that have the lowest level of development. Basically, this relates to more or less 150 countries out of 190 something, some say 5, 7, but they represent more or less 80% of the population worldwide. And these countries, even though they represent so many people, they are only responsible of 16% of the total CO2 emissions that have been emitted between the 1800s and the 1990s, which is ridiculous, right? Most of the people have contributed with so little. There is a big imbalance. Also, some 75 to 80% of the cost of the damage that will be caused by climate change will happen in these territories, basically because they are geographically placed in the tropics, which happen to be the areas that are going to be affected the most by climate change. And well, I don't have to tell you about the impacts that climate change brings, but these impacts, translated into economic terms, mean that developing countries, and I'm only talking about developing countries, have already raised the average cost of debt by $62 billion and will increase a lot. So the World Bank and the UNEP suggest that developing countries can face during this decade until the 2030, until the year 2030, can face only in mitigation costs between 140 and 174 billion US, and on adaptation around 140 to 300 billion per year. We're talking about costs annually. So overall, this could be somewhere around 280 to 474 billion, which is a very, very large amount of money. And we're talking about countries that are already facing problems in terms of employment, welfare, and they struggle to have access to finance. So most vulnerable countries will not have the capacity to bear with these costs and prevent climate-related impacts. So the key here is that developed countries that have benefited for ages from this consumption, this exploitation of resources, that have polluted to this extent the environment globally, and have benefited and have become wealthy precisely because of that, are definitely morally responsible. They are the ones to be blamed. And yet, developing countries are the ones that are going to suffer this. So besides this moral obligation, do they actually have a legal obligation? Are they legally obliged to cooperate and assist developing countries? So how is this tragedy of the commons addressed, regulated in international environmental law? So you have studied with Mar several global regulatory regimes, different ones, and you have studied the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which happens to contain the relevant principles and norms on climate change. They do contain also norms on climate finance, on the rules of the game of who has to pay for this mess and who has to help developing countries. And they also, the UNFCCC also have the institutions that translate this money into projects and help these developing countries. So today I will be studying this, I will be teaching you these norms and processes and institutions. So let's move on to the legal responsibility. So in the tragedy of the commons, is more or less some sort of story that was first told by a guy, Garrett Hardin, who is an economist. This is not legal at all. This is economics. And he basically portrayed this scenario in which there were some resources that were shared by people, and the question was, how are they most efficiently shared, let's say, or how should we constrain individuals that are sharing resources? And he argued that the most efficient way to deal with this issue was what he called the collective action. And this is basically, very roughly, a sort of top-down system in which a central power, establishes rules that are to be obeyed by the individuals. And in case these individuals are not following the rules, well, these rules should be executed somehow, enforced, let's say. So imagine in the example or the story about Barcelona and the Duomo, imagine the government or the town hall of Barcelona establishing some rules about who should eat how much. So the power would be establishing how much individuals should be eating, and in case this was not obeyed, there would be some sort of enforcement mechanism. Okay, there is a second approach, more recent, that was proposed by Elinor Ostrom. Elinor Ostrom earned the Nobel Prize for Economics thanks to this approach in her work governing the commons. Basically, she assessed how the individuals could be more efficient in sharing these resources, because she demonstrated that external pressures, such as this enforceability mechanism, do not work as well as other ways of promoting a sustainable use of resources. And she suggested, or rather demonstrated, that individuals are more efficient when they decide themselves, or self-organize, or self-regulate, and establish how much they should be consuming from a bottom-up perspective. Bottom being the individuals, up, establishing the rules. So this is called cooperative strategy or cooperative approach, and it's a theory of self-organized, self-governing, small-scale institutions as forms of action. So in our story, the case of the Duomo over Barcelona, basically people from El Born would be organized, and people from Pedralbes, and would cooperate with each other and establish what's the best way out. So ever since the UNFCCC was created, and now I'm bringing this to the law and to our field, ever since the UNFCCC was created, there have been very different means of regulating the tragedy of the commons, of how, these limited resources being air or the environment should be shared by the states, and how this whole thing should be addressed, climate change. And well, there have been some systems, some treaties that followed somehow this sort of collective action, the top-down system, and some others following the bottom-up. Examples of the top-down are the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, that you know about this, I don't have to tell you. But this treaty basically imposed top-down obligations on developed countries that had to mitigate to certain levels and also contribute through finance according to fixed quantities. it was a complete failure. So the United States did not ratify the treaty basically because there were other countries that were not part of it, even though they were wealthy, such as China or India. And yeah, Canada withdrew, and also Japan, New Zealand, and Russia. So complete failure. And there was another attempt in 2009, the Copenhagen Accord, that also tried to establish a top-down system of concrete regulations, top-down regulations that would be enforced, but it also failed. It was not approved. Well, on the other side of the coin, there have been mainly two very important treaties that have followed a different approach. These are the UNFCCC Convention, the one from 1992, and the very famous Paris Agreement. So these are very important in climate change in general, but very, very important in climate finance in particular. The idea of the bottom-up approach is something that I want to explore now. And I will be touching upon a principle that you have studied, a principle that is very important on international environmental law. And it's the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So this is a perfect opportunity for you to observe how this principle works in practice, and how it works in a very complex issue, such as climate change and development. So let's move to the UNFCCC Convention. So the UNFCCC Convention, on its Article 4.3, establishes an obligation for developed countries, concretely the countries that are listed in the Annex 2 list, to provide new and additional financial resources that are needed by developing countries to meet the agreed full incremental cost of implementing their policies on climate mitigation and adaptation, and that are agreed between a developing country party and international entity or entities that are operationalizing this whole thing. So what does this mean? So let's go part by part. So the obliged parties, the obliged subjects, are the Annex 2 countries, which are developed countries that are listed in the Annex of the Convention. And this includes 23 countries besides the members of the European Union. So these are obliged through a hard obligation that says or uses the word shall. So this is, in legal language, a hard obligation. Developed countries, and not all developed countries, not any developed country, but the developed countries that are in this list are obliged through this hard obligation to emit climate finance. So this somehow reflects the common but differentiated responsibilities, because it places obligations on a group of countries. Then new and additional financial resources. Well, this is not defined in the convention, but it's commonly agreed that this refers to only and specifically climate finance. So basically, traditionally, global or international cooperation and assistance has surrounded development assistance, the so-called official development assistance, or ODA. But here, there was a lot of efforts put on creating a specific obligation to deliver something separately, which would be climate finance, completely different from development finance. I will come back to this later. And the resources to be provided, the amount of money that should be delivered, the article simply refers to those that are needed by developing countries in order to meet their agreed full incremental costs. So they are not establishing fixed amount of funding. They are not saying, yeah, you should be delivering 2% of your GDP. They are basically establishing that the money that will be sent is that is going to be needed. The agreed incremental costs are just a part of a project that is completely directly related to climate change. So imagine a development project in, say, Kenya that is about building a dam in some river for, I don't know, improving access to water. And the government would need to say, well, you know, this is to a certain extent related to climate change, and that extra extent that is separated from development is the part that would be financed. I don't know if that is clear for you. If not, just feel free to pose questions. So yeah, there is not per se a top-down obligation here, as you see, besides the procedural obligation to deliver money. So countries have to deliver money, but we don't know how much money. It's up to countries. And so there are lots of bottom-up elements here in this obligation. So in relation to the subject developing countries, it's assumed that there is another list that is called non-Annex 1 countries, and it is assumed that it refers to those countries. So overall, the article created these obligations that are hard because they use the word shall, but are soft or are bottom-up because they decide how much they contribute with. Now, years later, there was a big change. Concretely, it took more than 2 decades, but the Paris Agreement was eventually adopted, and in its Article 9.1, it was established another obligation, a hard obligation as well, delivered to developed countries through the use of shall, the word shall. But I don't know if you pick up a difference here. Does anyone see a difference as compared to the obligation that is delivered to Annex 2 countries, sorry. So in the Paris Agreement, the obligation is posed on developed countries. So the obligation is not tackling a list of countries, a concrete number of countries. It generally refers to developed countries. So by doing so, the Paris Agreement extended the legal obligation, the legally binding obligation, this hard obligation through the use of the word shall, from Annex 2 countries, which were these 23 countries on top of the European Union, to all developed countries. But they do not define what developed countries means. So this broke down this hard boundary between list of countries, non-Annex 1 countries, Annex 1 countries, Annex 2 countries, in favor of a more suitable and flexible approach. So before, it used to be the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. But the Paris Agreement added this sentence, in light of different circumstances. And this is very interesting because this is what enabled to adapt to new circumstances, because 23 years later, developing countries were not the same as the developing countries that were listed in the non-Annex 1 list, sort of. Because, for instance, China or the Emirates were very wealthy countries that could consider themselves developed. So it became somehow a more flexible approach that was more adaptable to new circumstances. So, but still, the categories of developed and developing countries are still relevant. But this approach reflects on the responsibilities of countries, the capabilities, and somehow it resonates on this cooperative approach that Elinor Ostrom was talking about, even more than the previous convention, because the countries are deciding themselves whether to cooperate. They are saying, yeah, I consider myself developed country, so I will be obliged by this norm. It's quite strange, isn't it? If you want to comment on it or interrupt me, just raise your hand or use the microphone, or may You may as well use the chat whenever you feel like. This is your class, it's not my class. Well, the Paris Agreement introduced something that is even more interesting than this, and is the fact that on the second paragraph of Article 9, it recommended, it encouraged the other countries that are not developed to contribute as well. So this resonates even more on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. This resonates even more because it establishes common responsibilities to all countries, but in the light of their capacities, in the light of their capabilities, in the light of whether they are developed or not. So there is a lot of dimensions here. If you consider yourself developed, you're obliged. If not, you may contribute if you want. As for the quantities, again, the Paris Agreement did not establish fixed amounts of quantities that should be delivered. However, the Paris Agreement established two principles that inspire somehow these quantities, or rather inform the quantities that should be, the amounts of funding that should be delivered. The first one is the principle of highest possible ambition. And the second principle is the principle of progression that has to inform the highest level of ambition. So basically, the Paris Agreement is saying, you contribute whatever you want, but it must be ambitious and it must be progressive. So it's not saying United States, you must contribute by 2% of your GDP, but rather saying in United States, I don't care how much you send, but it must be ambitious and it must be progressive. So if this year you're contributing or you're delivering 1 million, the following year it will be at least 1,000,001. So again, we have an obligation, or we actually have different obligations for rich countries to deliver climate finance to poor countries. However, these obligations follow bottom-up approach, right? Insofar as countries decide themselves whether to contribute and to which level. And what do you think about this system? Isn't it a little bit crazy? So, like, I don't know, imagine that this was the way taxes worked. Imagine that every year you would just have to contribute to the state with the amount that you find appropriate. Let's say you have to be ambitious, though, but you can, and it must be progressive. Every year you have to contribute with more money. But imagine this was the system that was implemented. How do you think things would look like? So there are some top-down elements. Okay, I have a hand raised. You may speak if you want. Irene, right? Yes.
Victoria, actually, but yes, hi.
Oh, okay, Victoria.
No, it's fine. It's my middle name. But yeah, I just wanted to comment that I think it's hard with that type of system without a certain incentive, because all the states need obviously to have some reason to be so ambitious, like they want to gain something. It's very rare for a state to make sacrifices without having something in return. So they need some sort of incentive.
And what do you think the incentive may be?
Maybe something to do with like a good reputation or something like making up for the moral dilemma or something.
Reputation, as in if they contribute, they may be like the good people of the movie.
Yeah.
Or what kind of reputation, and whose reputation? Like before who? Like within countries, like the reputation with their peers or with their people.
I'm thinking like internationally, if a developed country uses a lot, like emits a lot of carbon dioxide and stuff like that, if they kind of make up for it by being very active, by being very like generous in their green, like kind of greenwashing, they seem better, I guess.
Excellent. Yes, that's very correct, Victoria. Thank you very much. Yeah, indeed, there is some sort of mechanism that is implemented. It's called the global stocktake. I don't know if you have studied this, but it's part of the UNFCCC. And so basically, it's just meetings among representatives of the states. There are members to the UNFCCC that meet every year in summits, and there is a sort of obligation to report on the finance that is delivered. And so basically, when these summits happen, countries say, yeah, I have delivered this amount of money, and there is a lot written about this, and it happens to be a way of promoting public accountability. Public accountability is related to reputation. It's what Victoria was saying. So basically, these countries want to show that they are contributing, and they have to say how much they are contributing with. And then the rest of the countries are going to be examining this and considering whether this is ambitious or not, and whether they have become progressive as compared to other years. How do you think this affects to the whole process? Do you think that this is enough? Do you think that this is a mechanism, this bottom-up sort of process is enough? So imagine, for instance, that in this class, imagine that we were in the class, and well, now I cannot see what you guys are doing, but imagine that I could tell off people that are not paying attention to the class. All right, kind of like it happens in the school, in high school. Because I'm not a police, so I don't care. But imagine we were in high school, and so I had the power. Do you think that this would somehow promote people listening to me, or do you think that a bottom-up approach in which you yourselves can check on whether people are actually contributing to the class and making a nice environment, let's say, would be better because people would gain interest? That's the basic theory that is underpinning Elinor Ostrom's thesis. The fact that if people sort of self-organize themselves and self-establish, I will reply to Marta right now, self-establish sort of the guidelines to follow, this is more efficient. But I was posing these questions now because after getting to Marta's comment, I will check how useful this system is, whether this sort of, public accountability, public reputation accountability is enough, whether we have enough quantities of money going from developed countries to developing countries. So Marta says that at least the Paris Agreement has entered into force quicker than the Kyoto Protocol. I think that's thanks to this mechanism. Exactly. Well, and also the Kyoto Protocol was not really popular among developed countries, right? Because they were like, why would I give up my my sort of power, let's say, in favor of this global organization or this treaty regime that can actually punish me if I don't fulfill these top-down obligations. And now we have the Paris Agreement, which has a virtually global membership, or will have virtually global membership once the United States is back. And maybe that's the reason why it's so popular, right? So yeah, thanks a lot for your contributions. Now I would like to move on to this, the operationalization of these obligations. How is this money actually flowing from developed countries to developing countries, and how is it transformed into projects, in order to see whether this is actually working, this bottom-up approach is actually working or not. 1 second. So the UNFCCC has something that is called the financial mechanism, and this is sort of umbrella. Imagine an umbrella with different institutions within it. The relevant institutions that channel this money that goes from developed to developing countries are 5. These are 5 financial instruments that are different amongst themselves, that basically receive the money, place it in what is called a trustee, that is like the treasurer, like Bárcenas, that is the World Bank. And then these funds, these financial instruments, receive applications from developing countries, approve them, and then call on the World Bank, on the trustee, to send the money that has been approved to the developing country for the project to be implemented. So the 5 financial instruments are the Global Environment Facility Trust Fund, the Least Developed Countries Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and the Green Climate Fund. So I don't want to go too much into this, because this is pure governance, and I don't want to get into the very norms and processes of each of them, because they are slightly different. But I will just highlight the main characteristics of these funds. So the first fund was first adopted in 1992, just like the UNFCCC convention, comes with a council, with its own council, and with its own secretariat. And yeah, it has different activities that it finances, but all of them relate to climate adaptation and mitigation projects, okay? And as an example, let me talk to you about this project, Environmental Protection and Sustainable Integrated Management of the Guarani Aquifer. So I wanted to highlight or mention this project because I think it's very particular. It's not like the rest of the projects that I will mention. Why is it? Well, because it's a project that basically consisted on establishing institutions. So when you think about climate finance, you may think about, I don't know, building sort of irrigation systems or things like this. Actually, it's not only about that. There is a lot about creating institutions and facilitating sort of technical development, let's say, technical assistance. In this case, well, the Mercosur countries, so Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, got a grant of $13.4 billion in order to elaborate an institutional framework for managing and preserving the Guarani Aquifer, that is one of the largest groundwater reservoirs in the world. Well, the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund are two funds that were both adopted in 2001, and they both belong to the Global Environment Facility. So the Global Environment Facility is sort of an international organization that has different trust funds. One is the trust fund of the GEF Trust Fund, and two more are the LDCF and SCCF. And these two, however, focus rather on climate adaptation projects. They count with their own council, but in practice is the GEF Council actually, but it just holds meetings that are particular to projects that are applied, that are studied for LDCF or SCCF funding. And they also have the or use the secretariat of the Global Environment Facility. So by means of examples, a project that has been approved and implemented by the LDCF, is building capacities to integrate water resources planning in agricultural development. And this is more of like sort of traditional adaptation project. It's a project that was granted to Cambodia. It was a grant, so grants are the rule. Usually grants are amounts of money that are given and do not have to be they don't have to give the money back, as opposed to loans that need to be repaid. So this was a 2.14 million grant to build the capacity of local communities in Cambodia in order to adapt to changes in water resources resulting from climate change through the construction of irrigation systems. I don't know if you guys have been to Cambodia. I was in Cambodia a couple of summers ago. Was my last trip before the. You have Victoria. Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful country. It was my last trip before the whole pandemic thing. So Victoria, maybe did you cross the country? Because I did, and it changes a lot. So if you go to the south, it's rather humid, but if you are like kind of in the center where Angkor Wat is, it's rather dry. And so this project was kind of holistic and aimed at developing irrigation systems that were good for both floods and water scarcity. Very interesting project. Okay, so the fourth fund is the Adaptation Fund. That was also established in 2001, but it was set to operate under the Kyoto Protocol. However, since the Kyoto Protocol has not been that successful, it is expected to cease being a component of this instrument and to start operating under the UNFCCC Convention and the Paris Agreement. The Adaptation Fund is administered by an independent board, and it shares its secretariat with the Global Environment Facility. The Adaptation Fund, like the LDCF and SCCF, is focused on adaptation activities. By means of example, the project Ecosystem-Based Adaptation at Communities of the Central Forest Corridor in Tegucigalpa is a project that was recently approved a couple of years ago in Honduras, in an area that has been negatively affected by desertification and droughts and lots of fires that have really diminished the biodiversity in the area, in this corridor, in the Central Forest Corridor, and affected the local communities that lived there. And basically the project included measures such as restoration of the trees, the pines, and mixed forest areas damaged. It also introduced the protection measures against fires and implemented drought management adaptation measures. And finally, the Green Climate Fund was the last fund that has been established. It was established in 2010, and is set to become the main fund. It's the most ambitious one, is the one that is moving the largest amount of resources, and it has its own board and its own secretariat. Last example. So this is a project in IT that granted $8.4 million to provide affordable and reliable access to green energy in the IT communities. So, sorry if this was too dense, but basically the idea that I want you to keep is the fact that so developed countries send this money to the funds that is placed on the trustee, the world. Parallelly, developing countries may develop a project or think about a project and request to a partner agency, an agency that is related to the funds, to any of the 5 funds, tell them, okay, we want to develop this project, we need your help. Basically, the developing country, together with the partner agency, develop this project, and once it's ready, they propose the project to the fund. The secretariat of the fund examines the proposal and usually sends it back to the partner agency. And there will be a back and forth move between the partner agency and the secretariat until the project is ready. Once the project is ready, the secretariat delivers the application to the decision-making body, so the council or the board, which will approve the project, will call on the trustee for the trustee to send the money to the partner agency, and the partner agency will finally implement the project. Now we could talk for ages about this process because there is a lot behind it, but I will just highlight the main criticisms that these instruments have received. This whole process in general has received. The first and main criticism maybe relates to the quantities, and this is something that I had been touching upon during the class. So let's see whether this bottom-up approach is actually successful, whether what Victoria was suggesting, this game of reputation, does actually bring us far enough. So there are studies that suggest that the total climate finance flows every year over the last few years, the last couple of years, are estimated at $681 billion. But out of these, a study from the OECD estimated that only 71 billion were provided and mobilized from developed to developing countries. So from 681 billion, only 71 billion were coming from developed countries. The rest was mainly moved by private companies or private actors, individuals, or other organizations, NGOs, etc. And out of this money coming from developed countries, most of it was part of a development program. So as I mentioned before, the legal obligations established that the finance should be new and additional. And new and additional meant that it should be different from development assistance. Well, still most of the finance, the climate finance that is moved to developing countries, is or goes in the form of development assistance, which means that only a fraction of climate finance represents the new and additional climate funding that developing countries need and that they have a right to according to the instruments that we have studied in this class. And consequently, international organizations, NGOs, and academics, as myself, agree that the supply of climate funds lags far behind demand. So this may be related or not to the fact that according to these applications, countries decide for themselves whether to cooperate with and assist developing countries or not. And if they decide to contribute, they decide to which level they contribute. So the question is whether this bottom-up approach is enough or is not? Should we introduce more top-down elements? There are some developing countries that have been consistently demanding that at least 2% of the GDP from developed countries should be delivered in the form of climate finance. Well, if we examine the countries that have contributed through climate finance, we see that there are 14 developed countries, arguably developed countries, or at least very wealthy countries, that have not contributed, that have not delivered a single dollar to developing countries for financing their projects, the mitigation and adaptation projects. Some of these are Croatia, Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. These countries have not contributed. So yes, Furio Viotti, did I pronounce it correctly? Furio. If a developed country decides not to contribute, can be used a tool of name and shame. Yeah, that's exactly the sort of enforceability process that I was talking about. These sort of global stocktakes, these meetings, these summits that take place every year, in which countries say, yeah, I have delivered this amount of money to these funds, and then the rest will close at them or will say, oh, that's not enough. But let me ask you something, guys. Has anyone here in this class ever heard about these countries that have not contributed, not contributing at all? Or have you ever read in the newspapers whether, you know, the US or the UK or Spain has delivered enough money or not? Exactly, Marta. No, it doesn't get to us. So, you know, maybe this naming and shaming game, maybe it works to a certain level in these summits, but we don't know about it. There is a lot of criticism in academia. There are lots of papers written about the insufficiency of the funds, but this does not seem to trigger a lot. I think the way through this, if you want to know my opinion, the way out is people become aware of this problem, because, you know, when people get to know about these things and they start to demand or ask for accountability to their governments, that's when changes happen. I don't know if you have seen the documentary Before the Flood that Leonardo DiCaprio produced. In this documentary, basically they mentioned the case of the legalization of the homosexual marriage in the United States, which was done under the Obama administration. And it's really interesting because when it first came to the Oval Office, this topic, Obama said, no, I don't see why two people from same sex should get married. And basically the polls said that people were not really concerned about it or were not in favor. But when this changed and when people started to be concerned about it, he basically legalized homosexual marriage. And it's kind of what happens with climate change. The more it is, the more the topic is on the streets, the more aware people are, the more, you know, political parties start to care about it. And it's really interesting because, you know, we see in Spain, for instance, that all political parties are really concerned about climate change now. Like even like populars, which never really cared about it or were really, maybe were more supportive of fossil fuels. Now they consider themselves quite green and talk about renewables a lot. So maybe that's the way out. So The second criticism is related to the decision making, to this process through which the projects are approved. So ideally, if I had planned this beforehand, and this is my bet, this is my fault, I would have suggested you reading some articles before the class, because these articles are really interesting. But basically, there are many authors and many articles as well about this and about how the money goes from developed countries to developing countries, and about failures in this process. There are some authors that talk about fairness of the funds. There are some authors talking about the insufficiency of the definitions of the activities that are funded. I mentioned, I didn't want to go too much into it, but I mentioned that each fund has different internal norms, and they use different definitions of activities that are funded, of countries that are susceptible of receiving funding. Well, they are really vague, and one big problem is the fact that if you're a developing country and you need this funding and you want to apply for funding, you don't really know whether your application will be successful. And this is a big problem, because these countries invest quite a lot of time and a few officials in order to develop a project that may end up in the trash. Then the length of approval is something that is quite challenging, because you really need to make sure that the project is good enough so that it won't have any spillovers on other people or vulnerable people. We will talk about it just right now. But at the same time, it takes a lot of time. You know, this move from the fund, the secretariat of the fund, back to the partner agency, back and forth. This move takes a lot of time, a lot of months, and usually there are around 2 to 3 years that pass from the application to the actual implementation. Sometimes it reaches even 8 years, depending on the size of the project. Now, it may not look very significant, but when we talk about climate change, there is some urgency, and if there is a community that does not have access to water, maybe 8 years is too much, and it may be too late by the time the project is implemented. Then there are lots of criticisms about the recipient countries, about the fact that this is really funny. Well, it's actually not that funny, but it's interesting, the fact that the wealthiest countries among developing countries, so developing countries that are kind of wealthy, happen to have received more funding than those that are the poorest. There are some studies that say that this is maybe related to the fact that they have more resources to apply or make better applications. I don't know, but it sounds very strange, doesn't it? So right now, the institutions are going through amendments and trying to change their policies. But the question is, will this be enough? This is something that we will see with time, and only time will tell. And then the last, and in my opinion, most interesting criticism is the negative impact that projects have on local stakeholders, because this all sounds super amazing, right? The fact that there is money going to poor countries. Maybe it's not enough, but it's money, and money is always welcome. Well, not always. Projects sometimes have negative impacts on some people, especially on vulnerable communities such as civil society organizations or companies, or indigenous people, women within countries. So I would like to talk, because we don't have that much time, I would like to talk about two projects, a mitigation project and an adaptation project that had negative impacts on local stakeholders and local communities. So the first one, a climate adaptation project, is called Ecosystem-Based Adaptation for Rural Resilience. It was implemented in Tanzania. What you see in this image is the warrior dance of the Maasai community, an indigenous community based in Tanzania. And that's the warrior dance, very famous because these guys can jump for meters. It's crazy. These are 3 women from this community, and this community relies a lot on their lives, on their lifestyle, on their animals, on their cattle. They really rely on them. Is their basic source of wealth, let's say, or livelihood. Well, against this backdrop, Tanzania requested the LDCF 7.57 million for this project that was approved in 2015 and is being implemented at this very time, at the time of this class. What did happen to the Maasai community? Well, there is another sort of group, human group in this area, in the area in which the project was implemented. That is basically, they are farmers and they rely a lot on agriculture. Well, the project mainly aimed at promoting irrigation and access to water to both communities, to the Maasai and to the farmers. However, the investments on irrigation are raising land access problems and conflicts between the Maasai and the farmers. And can you imagine why? Well, basically, the farmers have most of the domain of the land in which these projects are being implemented. However, the Maasai largely depend on pastoralism, and they need water for their animals. And therefore, since they don't have access to water, and most of the irrigation systems are in the farmers' lands, they have to go through the farmers' lands. They have to encroach their lands, and this is causing a number of problems among these two groups of people. This is the classic example of adaptation projects that aim at promoting access to water, or to have access to water services, and yet they ignore some necessities that local people living in these countries have, and as a consequence, these projects trigger conflicts between different groups of people. The other example is the project addressing barriers to the adoption of improved charcoal production technologies and sustainable land management practices through an integrated approach. So this is a mitigation project that was approved by the GEF Council in 2012. So the LDCF granted, the GEF Trust Fund granted 3.48 million to Uganda through the GEF agency, the partner agency UNDP. And the project aimed mainly at reducing carbon emissions. Okay, so here in the image you have a couple of pictures of what the charcoal consists on. The first picture you see that lots of sticks are piled in the form of a pyramid, and then these sticks are covered with land, and then they are burned. And through these means, this is the source of energy of some communities in Uganda. Okay, this is called charcoal. And the project aimed at making it more sustainable and making it more advanced, let's say, so that it would emit less CO2. So it would implement or it would fund this sort of cages that you see in the picture. And it would also consist on landing eucalyptus. Now, this is the result of the project. Lots of trees, local trees, have been cut down, putting an end to a lot of biodiversity in the area in which the project has been implemented, so that eucalyptus trees would be landed. Now, apart from this ecocide, eucalyptus trees consume lots of water. And as a consequence, community members have seen their land become bare and drier and less arable. And as a consequence, local stakeholders have seen their livelihoods harmed and their food security affected. So, you know, sometimes projects look like the best way through problems that are posed by climate change. But if you dig in, if you have a closer look, you end up seeing that there are lots of problems, especially when it comes to decisions that are adopted in Washington, D.C., in some office, by people that know nothing about the countries in which these projects are implemented, about their necessities. They fully relied on the applications of governments that are sometimes disconnected from these local communities in which the projects are implemented. So as a consequence, there is a large body of academics, of literature that demand that the funds, the climate funds, should be accountable to local stakeholders, should be more accountable to them. But what's the problem here? You as international environmentalist lawyers, what do you think is the main project when it comes to demanding accountability to a global body? So international law, what's international law? Internations. The main subject of international law are countries, not international or global administrations or global regulatory regimes, right? This does not mean that international organizations are not accountable or not tied to some obligations. Sometimes, often, they are tied to, or they are bound by human rights treaties. But that's not the common rule, right? These global administrations, these global entities, are neither subject to the national regimes, the national legal systems of the countries in which they are implementing their projects. I mean, the administrative court of Uganda cannot sue and enforce obligations upon the Green Climate Fund. Nor they are accountable, or they are tied to these treaties, right? That's a problem. So this reflects on the much wider process of globalization, of how public power is increasingly shared among a number of actors that are not the traditional actors that used to have power, such as states or empires. This power is increasingly exercised by global actors that are nonetheless accountable to the communities or the individuals that are suffering their power or are subject to their power, nor to the states that are members of these institutions. At the same time, states do not have the monopoly on regulatory power. We see that an issue such as climate change is regulated by a global regulatory regime such as the UNFCCC, which are establishing which the rules of the game are, how the tragedy of the commons is addressed, and they also have the processes, or they establish the processes, and they establish the institutions that operationalize these things that nonetheless affect, as we have seen, local communities. So this is eroding the traditional separation between national and international regulation and decision making, while challenging the principles upon which international law was created. So overall, in this class, we saw that climate change is a tragedy of the commons, in the sense that it poses risk on resources that are shared by all of us, and we individually benefit from exploiting these resources. However, we also benefit as a group when we have, or we sacrifice ourselves because we benefit from a sustainable environment. We have seen that there is a lot of inequality, and in order to regulate this tragedy of the commons, this use of resources, there is a lot to be taken into account, a lot related to the history of colonialism, the development at the cost of the sustainability of others. And we see that developing countries, as a result, have to deal with the problem, and they do not have the capacity to deal with this problem. And in order to deal with this problem, we have delegated our responsibility on a global actor that is not accountable to local communities that are negatively affected by this global actor. So I hope that this triggered something in this class. I hope that it wakes up some interest. If so, I'm more than happy to solve your questions if you ever come up with questions. I'm going to write down my email just in case you have any questions. So that's my email. If you have any questions, comments, criticisms, just feel free to write. I'm reachable, I'm available. Also, I'm aware that you're in your fourth and last year of your bachelor, and I was very recently there, and I know what it is to not know or not be entirely sure what to do afterwards. Ever since I finished, I've studied abroad. I did some masters, and I'm finishing a PhD. I'm about to start working in a corporate law firm. So in case you want to hear about my experience or want to know about the feasibility of writing a PhD or how to apply to a company or whatever, I'm also happy to solve your questions and to share with you my short experience. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. I guess that we have just lost your image, so maybe your camera is not active anymore, or
is it?
So we cannot see you. We can't hear you, and not
no?
you. I don't know. No, I don't know why. No,
well, that's a strange.
So I'm just seeing the black screen. Sorry.
Yeah, I cannot see you.
You cannot see either of us. I don't know why. I don't know. But you can hear us.
Yeah.
Some of you can see us, and others cannot see us. Okay, thank you. So I think we thank you very much for this interesting and suggestive presentation. I think that it's just particularly illustrative with this presentation of some projects, so that we can then really have an idea on what is happening with those funds, or with those projects funded for this mechanism. I think that we still have, well, some minutes if any one of you want to put any question or want to make any comment. Yes, Charlotte.
Yes, hello. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. And then I have two things. One of them is a comment of some sort, and the other one would be a question. And my comment would be that going back to the very first thing you explained with the difference between the bottom up and the top down, that I, of course, definitely see how this would work and all of that. But I also think that this really relies on the concept of everybody sort of having the same opinion and working towards the same goal. And I think that concepts that have relied on this historically have oftentimes failed rather spectacularly. So I think that this is just very important to note. And then the question I have is also in that area, and about these concepts. If you apply them to the area of international law, I was just wondering, do you really see that great of a difference between them? Because in international law, we have the concepts of non-interference and of sovereignty. So even if a state or some organization decides to sign up for a regime that would work top down, then they could leave that agreement at any time, right? So it always just depends on the goodwill of the participants.
All right, yes. Thank you so much for your question and your comment. And I think they are kind of related, right? Because, the idea underpinning what I call bottom-up treaties is the fact that it should be so wide that every country, and we have many countries that have very different interests, and we cannot debate them. We cannot divide these interests into developing countries that divide, that classic divide, because there are developing countries that have interest on fossil fuels and other countries that do not. So you have to make it so flexible that it suits to everyone. And maybe that's the reason why even the countries could potentially withdraw the agreement, and we have seen the US doing that very recently. It is still kind of challenging when it comes to a treaty that will tell you what to do and how to do it. And maybe that's why the Kyoto Protocol, precisely the Kyoto Protocol, I was setting these very, very hard lines in terms of how much should be mitigated by which countries, was not so popular. And now we have these flexible treaties, these flexible norms that tell you, you can mitigate as much as you want. It has to be progressive, it has to be ambitious, but up to you, and we're going to check on you. You're going to check on yourselves. Is seemingly working better. So maybe you're right in the fact that in the end, it shouldn't make, or theoretically shouldn't make that much of a difference, but in practice seems to make some difference, don't you think?
Yes, so you're saying that it's more about appearances and the image a certain treaty gives than about its actual mechanisms, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a lot about the image. It's a lot about what Victoria was saying, reputation. It's a lot about it's a lot about it. But at the same time, the actual mechanism, or how you present the mechanisms, matter. How you present the mechanisms matter. So to provide you with an example, there is another enforceability mechanism. It's called the it's some sort of conciliation through which, if there is sort of a problem between two countries, they must. So you trigger this conciliatory procedure, and from the moment in which it's triggered until it must be resolved, let's say, there is 1 year, 1 year in which this sort of conflict must cool down. If it is not solved through negotiation, then they are obliged to follow a conciliatory procedure. However, this procedure is entirely voluntary, sorry, in the sense that countries then decide, well, first of all, decide whether to take part of it, and secondly, decide whether the outcome will be implemented or not, you know. But at the same time, no one wants to go through that. Why? Because, you know, there's a lot of reputation behind it. There is a lot of pressure. You don't want to take part of that process. So far, we have not seen this process being triggered, and maybe just because of the fact that there is the possibility of this process happening, it is not triggered per se, or maybe because, you know, they could potentially face this process, is preventing countries from doing that, or maybe because countries do not want to trigger this process because they want to get the rest of the countries, even the ones that are breaching obligations, in the same side. You don't want to confront other countries. You want all countries to cooperate. So maybe that's the philosophy underpinning all these obligations, and the philosophy that is behind this sort of bottom-up approach.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlotte. There is a question on the chat too.
Oh, yes. A lot of time I feel like these sustainability projects are introduced in order to distract even ourselves from our own unsustainable lifestyle. Interesting. It is very good to have these sustainability projects, but the intentions are not necessarily so genuine. That's true. Maybe the government is saying, yeah, we're going to do a lot about climate change. See, we're going to apply for funding to the adaptation fund, let's say, and so on. But then you see that these projects are actually disconnected from the actual needs of the people living in these areas, right? If you are referring to the projects from the developing country side or viewpoint, yeah, that is correct. Maybe actually developing countries just, I don't know, are focused, or some governments of developing countries are so focused on yeah, getting funding and doing things, they do not actually identify what the real problems are. At the same time, I think it's very it's sort of lazy on the other side of the coin. I'm talking about from the developed countries' viewpoint. The fact that they just send money, and then these so they send money and they forget about it, let's say. So in a sense, they are just delivering money, and they do not really look at where the money goes, and there is not so much aid in terms of whether the actual problems are addressed, you know. And this is very, there is a lot of hypocrisy behind it, I think. Thanks a lot for your comment, Victoria. So we have another comment.
Yeah, there is a last question, and I think that's the last question.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, guys.
No, you can answer these last two questions.
Okay.
One from Joaquin and another one from Marta.
All right, Joaquin. Joaquin is asking when at the end of the conference I said that states do not have the capacity to deal with climate change issues. Do they really have the capacity, or they have lack of will on dealing with such issues? What do you mean, Joaquin? Do you mean whether the states, you mean, are you talking about developing countries? Whether developing countries, so developing countries do not have the capacity to deal with climate change issues? Oh, okay, I see. I think I know what you mean. So, yeah, yeah, maybe developing countries. I think developing countries generally or governments of developing countries, I want to think that they want to deal with the issues. I want to think so, but I think that in some countries they are really disconnected from how the impacts actually, how these things actually impact local communities. See, in many developing countries there is an elite that is not so poor and do not communicate really with other people or communities inside their countries, and so basically, you know, they sort of deal and manage their country, but there are some problems that they have in their countries that are unobserved, if you say. So yeah, maybe that's correct. Maybe they do not want to deal with the actual things, or they do not know how to deal with these things because they are too disconnected. Exactly, they have power, and there is, you know, there is sometimes, I'm generalizing this and I should not do that, but you know, there are elites that are really wealthy. There is wealth everywhere, even in the poorest country, and they are not really connected with the real problems, maybe.
Okay.
And Marta's question, yes,
Yeah,
sorry.
she just can have a quick answer, short answer.
Vale. About the lack of supervision of international bodies' funds, is there any proposition? I mean, has anyone proposed a control system? So, yeah, there are lots of systems. There are lots of propositions. I will be speaking about this very soon in May, right, Mar?
Sorry?
I will be presenting the problems of accountability of global institutions and how they respond to local stakeholders.
Yeah, that will happen in another seminar, which is about climate change. That will be in June. So
in
the
June
course will be already done, actually.
Vale.
Yeah, the classes will be over on the 10th. Yeah.
All right. Too bad.
So,
well, yeah, there is a lot.
So you can attend the seminar, and actually Marta, who asked the question, is one of those who should and actually must attend the seminar, because it's one of those on the diploma of EU environmental law diploma. So she will be there.
All right, Marta, I'll see you there, and I will reply to your question. But basically, there are many proposals, and I will be speaking about one that is called Global Administrative Law. You're welcome.
Okay, so let me just finish this session. Well, I would like again to thank you very much, Professor Larrea, for, I think it was a great presentation. We have learned a lot, and also thank you all of you for your questions and your comments. I hope that the other 22 people there were also interested, that they never say nothing, but they never say anything. Just allow me 2 minutes to remind you that our next class, that was our last class before the spring break. So please, well, remind that our next class will be the 7th of April, because here the 5th of April, it's a holiday. It's still in the period of spring holidays. So we will meet again next 7th of April. I will also publish the list of research papers. I will try to do that before Friday, so that you can start working if you wish during the spring break, just in case that you have any time. Also, for any comments or for advice or for whatever you need concerning the structure, the bibliography, whatever, we can always organize kind of a virtual meeting, or you can ask me by email, so then we can try to do that within the campus virtual. And then also please remember that on 19th of April, we will have another lecture, this time about the legal recognition of the right to a healthy environment on the European Union, that will be taught by Professor David Boy, who is also the current special relator at the United Nations for Human Rights and Environment. And he's also professor at the British Columbia University. So please remember that this is also, of course, a mandatory session, but that you need to pre-register in the, I don't know, it's a Google something. Also, it's a kind of register, so that you need to register, so then you can receive the link for that session. And a part of that, so, well, I would like to thank again Professor Larrea for this session, and well, to wish you, all of you, a very nice and the most possible nice spring break. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm now stopping here the recording. You will have the record session also